Hey guys, Brianna here. For my quantitative methods paper this semester, I wanted to study sexual orientation and race as predictors of religiosity. So I think it's important to go ahead and define religiosity because the definition often varies between different researchers. But basically, religiosity is a layered construct that includes commitment to a system of beliefs, engagement in religious behavior and practices, and social relationships that result from commitment and participation in organized religious activity, often within an institution or community. We might think of this as how often do you pray? How often do you go to church services? Or how often do you go to your church about services that aren't necessarily related to religious activities? You might think about it as like how often do you hang out with church friends? These are all aspects that kind of get at this idea of religiosity. And so I do want to go ahead and do a review on the literature. So within the literature on religiosity, there's several levels to it, but I'll start with the first one that I kept seeing, and it's this idea of religiosity on well-being. I think generally speaking, much of the researchers found that overall, people who report higher levels of religiosity tend to have better well-being, mentally, physically, tend to have lower stress levels and general happiness. And then some researchers took it another level and compared it across racial groups. With the first kind of level is focusing on black and white differences in well-being from religiosity. We do know that black people tend to be more religious, and that religiosity can function as like a stress relief kind of buffer for them in times of strain. It also helps with Latinos with similarly, and but overall, basically, Latino and Black individuals tend to report higher levels of religiosity, and it tends to function as it lowers their stress. It makes them have closer relationship with friends and family, and overall better mental health. And so, interestingly enough, for LGBT religious individuals, religiosity may have an opposite effect. They tend to report higher levels of internalized homophobia, higher levels of depression, and lower levels of acceptance from peers and family members, which can have drastic effects over time. And then another level that was in the literature was this idea of religiosity on perception of LGBT members. And so often enough, they would ask, different religious sects, how do you kind of feel about LGBT members? Are you accepting of their policies and stuff like that? And it's the finding was that the more religious you are, or the more higher religious levels that many people have, the often enough they are less accepting of LGBT peers, LGBT policies that benefit LGBT members, same-sex marriage, things like that. And so and then some researchers have noted that religious denomination is another level of this. And so it tends to be like Southern Baptists, Black individuals tend to be much less accepting of LGBT members, which we know that anecdotally, but it's interesting to actually see it play out in research. Yeah. And so if you have higher levels of religiosity, generally speaking, those people tend to have less acceptance of LGBT members. And then I think I saw a couple articles that kind of get at this idea of spirituality, which is kind of similar to religiosity, but it can be connected, but it's really kind of different too. Many people identify as being spiritual as opposed to religious, and those people tend to have higher acceptance of LGBTQ members. Excuse me. So my own contribution to the research was just basically I wanted to understand primarily, can race and sexual orientation predict religiosity? I felt that it was necessary to kind of ask this question because much of the literature, like I said, it gets at well-being and it gets at kind of perceptions of of LGBT members, but it does not consider just LGBT members who may be also religious. And so I wanted to see if there was like a relationship that we could find with that. And then I also wanted to consider the difference in the mean religiosity levels of Black and white individuals, and then the difference between the mean religiosity levels of straight and LGBT members. And so I decided to go ahead and go with the method section. I used the general social survey because I felt that it's reflective of the U.S. population. It provided very socioeconomic demographic values for my purpose. And there's several items in there that conceptualize religiosity pretty well. And then so I use the independent variables of race and then sexual orientation. And my dependent variable was religiosity, which for the purpose of my research will focus as a continuous variable, even though it's more ordinal. And then I use the control variable of education, which is also continuous. So like I said, I had to treat the nominal variables of sexual orientation and race as continuous variables for a multivariate regression. They had to be recoded because category variables aren't used in regression. And so I used the response categories of white and straight for my comparison groups. I also did a univariate analysis to kind of get the sample characteristics and kind of get at how the sample looks. I did a bivariate analysis to compare the different means between my independent variables. And then I performed a multivariate regression to understand the overall effect that race and sexual orientation may have on level of religiosity. And then here we have sort of like our table that kind of gets at our univariate analyses. I did want to just kind of point out one thing here, that the lesbian and gay category only has 82 people in it, and the bisexual category only has 87. So for our bivariate analysis, I did find that there was a significant relationship between the mean levels of religiosity of LGBT members and straight individuals. And so that's definitely something to consider. And for this specific question, I did a recode gay and bisexual. I put them together. In my recode, I put them together because I felt like it gave it more statistical power to do that. And then I just compared them to straight. And then for my other one, there's a significant relationship between mean levels of religiosity of Black and white individuals, as you can see. Yeah, so both of these are significant, and I thought that was interesting. Okay. And then for the overall multivariate regression results, I had significant models. So yes, race and sexual orientation does have a statistically significant impact on religiosity. And then for model 1, I did it without controlling for education. And for model 2, I went ahead and controlled just to see if it made any difference. Yes. And then so specifically for the R-squared value, it's very small. It's only 2%. Race and sexual orientation only explain 2.8% of the variance in religiosity. So I feel like my analysis should really be taken with a grain of salt. But the model overall indicates that one's racial group has a positive relationship with one's self-reported religious attendance, while one's sexuality has a negative relationship with one's religious attendance. And then these associations seem to depend on educational levels. So education might be a buffer in that sense. Okay, and then so overall, I think that my finding is useful because it kind of gets it takes away from that literature that we need to there are LGBT members that are religious and that we need to consider them in our analysis. And not just kind of view everything from like the perceptions of them or anything like that. Maybe it's useful to just kind of consider that they exist. And then I did kind of want to go ahead and talk about the GSS as a limiting data set. So in the racial categories, the response categories are other, Black, and white, which for me, I believe that pigeonholes a lot of individuals because initially when I did my analysis, I wanted to consider Hispanics in my comparison groups, but like Latino or Hispanic individuals were coded as other in the analysis or in the GCSS data set, so that kind of limited my ability to make those comparisons. And I think pigeonholing them into this one category makes it very hard to make comparisons across groups. And that goes for Asian Americans or biracial individuals who identify as more than one race. We shouldn't just pigeonhole them into another category because it really leaves out a significant portion of people. And then I just kind of feel like that perpetuates the black-white dichotomy that we have seen in a lot of literature, especially if you're a race scholar. Anyway, thank you guys for your time, and I hope that made sense for y'all.